Hello, scholars. In this video, we're going to cover a couple of important concepts and terminology, terms that are used in discussing metabolism. And so we're going to spend some time talking about a really important molecule, ATP, how it transfers energy and is used by molecules in the cell to do work. We're also going to define and give examples of an endergonic and exergonic reaction, and explain why the cell couples endergonic and exergonic reactions together, why one has to happen before the other one. So here we go. First of all, just a quick review. Breaking bonds blanks energy, while making bonds blanks energy. So keep in mind, breaking bonds always takes energy. Making bonds restabilizes the atoms, and because they're more stable, is going to release energy. And in every chemical reaction, you're going to do both of these things. You're going to make the bonds and you're going to break the bonds. And the net result of that energy determines overall whether the reaction needs to absorb energy to happen or whether it's going to release energy as a result. We kind of talked about this in our activity. So this is a very important diagram to understand. This is called the ATP-ADP cycle. And up at the top here, we have ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate because you'll notice in here are 3 phosphate groups. And this molecule stores a lot of chemical energy in these bonds between the phosphate groups. Phosphate groups are negatively charged. They don't really like being next to each other. And so it takes a lot of energy is potentially going to be able to easily be released when those bonds are broken and made to remove that phosphate group. So when the cell needs energy, it'll take the molecule of ATP, it'll remove one of those phosphate groups, and the bonds that are made and broken during that process end up releasing a net of energy. So energy is ultimately released. You're then left with a molecule of ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with 2 phosphate groups attached. Through the processes of cellular respiration, we are going to reattach those phosphate groups. We're going to regenerate these molecules of ATP. And so all the bonds that are made and broken during that process are going to require an input of energy. We get that from the food that we eat and the process of cellular respiration, which we'll talk more about later. Here are just a few examples of things that cells use ATP for. Cells are going to use ATP to do chemical work, to perform chemical reactions. They are going to use ATP to do transport work, to move materials against their concentration gradients, either in or out of the cell. And we're going to use ATP for mechanical work. Every time you move your body, if you need to do when you do muscle contractions, that uses a lot of ATP. So when we talk about metabolism, we're talking about all of the chemical reactions of life. And so there are 2 main categories. We perform anabolic reactions, which make larger molecules out of smaller ones. So think we're making polymers from monomers, right? We're making proteins from amino acids. We're making larger lipids out of fatty acids. And that process, you might remember, is dehydration synthesis, where we take monomers and we put them together to form polymers. The flip side of that is catabolic reactions, where you break down more complex molecules into simpler ones. And so, for example, hydrolysis reactions, that's where we're breaking them apart. You might have heard about anabolic steroids in the news. A lot of athletes have gotten in trouble for using anabolic steroids. They're called anabolic steroids because they help build muscle, right? They build up those larger molecules. And so that might help you remember that anabolic reactions, you're bulking up, you're taking simpler molecules and making more complex ones, like making lots of large proteins from amino acids, and catabolic is the opposite. Kind of a quick concept check question here. Will dehydration synthesis be anabolic or catabolic? And will hydrolysis be anabolic or catabolic? Look back at your ATP-ADP cycle. Which part of this cycle is anabolic? Which part is catabolic? And keep in mind, we are breaking off a smaller piece here. This is a hydrolysis reaction, and so that is going to be catabolic, right? On the flip side, when we add that phosphate back on, we're again making the molecule larger, more complex. That's going to be anabolic. So like we mentioned previously, some chemical reactions are going to release a net amount of energy. And so we call those reactions exergonic. Energy is exiting or leaving. And so when we perform hydrolysis reactions or catabolism reactions in general, those are usually exergonic. They're going to end up releasing a net amount of energy when bonds are made and broken. On the flip side, some chemical reactions require an input of energy. They're endergonic. So when we make and break those bonds, we end up having to put more energy in than what we're going to get out. And that would include anything where we're making more complex molecules, dehydration, synthesis, and anabolism. Okay. Another way to think about this is that if you're taking molecules apart, if you're making them less complicated, there's a lower amount of organization that those products are going to have. It takes less energy to be in a less organized state. And so energy ends up being released. Vice versa, if you're making a more complex molecule, it takes energy to build something up and make something more complex. And so that's going to require an input of energy. Here's our ATP-ADP cycle again. See if you can locate the portion that's exergonic and the portion that's endergonic. We have a couple of diagrams here. On the side is Gibbs free energy. It's basically the amount of energy that's stored in our reactants and our products and the molecules that we have present. On the x-axis, we have the course of the reaction. So in both cases, we're starting with reactants and we're starting with products. Take some time to think about which one of these reactions you think is exergonic and endergonic and why. So in this first diagram here, the reactants are starting with more energy. The products are ending with less energy. That means over the course of the reaction, we have lost energy. This reaction is exergonic, okay? Because we have less energy in our molecules than we had before. I think a good analogy to this is to think about money. So if you start with a certain amount of money in your pocket at the beginning and you end with a lower amount of money in your pocket at the end, it means you lost it along the way. Vice versa, this is an endergonic reaction, okay? You're starting with less energy, less money in your pocket, and you're ending with more. That means that the reactants, the molecules, had to gain energy to reach this point of being a product. Exergonic reactions are, they do tend to happen because it's just easier in nature for us to break things down and make simpler molecules and release energy, but they don't just happen spontaneously. All reactions require some type of activation energy. We mentioned this with enzymes, that breaking any bond requires energy, and so even if the net reaction is going to release energy, you still have to have that initial energy to break the bonds. And that's really what activation energy does. And so you can think about this like a pile of wood will burn spontaneously once you get it started, right? So you have to provide that initial energy to start breaking the bonds so that when we reform them, we release that extra energy and the reaction continues to happen. And so when we think about enzymes, the reason why they're catalysts and they speed reactions up is because they lower that amount of starting energy that you need. So last kind of major concept here is the fact that organisms have to do both of these types of reactions, exergonic and endergonic. And in fact, the exergonic reactions really have to occur before the endergonic ones because we have to release the energy from chemicals in order to use that energy to build up more complicated molecules. And so if we start here on the top left, let's say we have some candy and that glucose goes into our bloodstream and our cells take it up. We do cellular respiration and break that sugar down. And in the process, we're making simpler molecules, right? This is a catabolic reaction and it's exergonic. We release chemical energy from those bonds of the sugar. That chemical energy we then use to make and build ATP molecules. So that's an endergonic process. We're making a more complex molecule. From there, the cell can use that ATP for whatever functions the cell needs to do. When we break that ATP back down into ADP, that's an exergonic reaction, and the energy is once again released. So we can use the energy from that process, from breaking the ATP down, to build all the molecules that our cells need. In this case, we're looking at protein synthesis, taking amino acids and putting them together to form a protein. So we have to digest our food. We have to do exergonic reactions in order to get the energy needed to do endergonic reactions. We have to digest our food and break it apart to release the chemical energy in order to synthesize all the molecules that our cells need to survive and for us to grow and replace damaged parts. It's kind of like you have to make money before you spend money. So you have to get the money or the energy by breaking the molecules apart, to do the work of breaking molecules apart before you can spend it and do the work of putting molecules together. Let me know if you have any questions.